We're recording.
Annie, bonjour. Hello. Laurie Magali and Monique Baudouin coming at you from SOS Radio. Bienvenue à SOS Radio. We are here today to discuss the situation at Laurentian University with Dr. David Leadbeater, Associate Professor of Economics at the university. And he's going to stay there if we have anything to say about it. Dr. David Leadbeater, hello.
Hello, bonjour.
How are you doing? So I'm going to hand it over to Laurie, who's going to get you going on talking about your research.
Okay, David, I know it's been a really hard couple of months, but we'd like to start talking to you about the work that you've been doing in Northern Ontario as a researcher and as a professor, and some of the current work that you've been doing and how it all connects together.
Well, thank you very much for asking me here to talk about this, which is near and dear to my heart. I've been dealing with research on hinterland and colonial areas most of my career, even as a graduate student. When I was working at the University of Alberta, I was concerned about the hinterland and colonial conditions of the province of Alberta and what it had meant. And when I came to Laurentian, those concerns continued. It took me a while, getting into Northern Ontario. I came in 1989 to sense some of the depths of the process of regional inequality, colonization, and the hinterland conditions of the North. But over time, I began to, get more deeply into the mechanisms that this was developing. And one of the first big projects was having a meeting, conference, in fact, and Laurie participated in that, about Sudbury, and looking specifically at Sudbury. And that came out in this book, which, Mining Town Crisis, about the power relations and the economic conditions in Sudbury. And then I moved to other areas, and I've spent a lot of time on individual mining communities. The first in the 90s was with Elliott Lake and the mass layoffs there, and I was involved in the largest layoff study of laid off miners ever done in Canada. And that was funded by the Canadian government. It never really, the results and the recommendations never really saw the light of day, but we continued to work on that, including then Sudbury and other communities. Well, there's a pattern that affects mining communities and other hinterland areas. And it's not a happy story in this time of the development of Canada. There's a lot of people who are hurting from the nature of the development. Communities are declining, both in jobs and population. And in general, the issues of Indigenous land rights and self-government continue to be unresolved. So what we have to do in the present period is find ways to raise the issues, from my point of view as a researcher, in new ways, in deeper ways that push the debate forward. Now, about 6 or 7 years ago, I started talking with a filmmaker, Lloyd Salamone, about possibilities of research related to his area of Timmins. He had come to me and said that Schumacher in particular, but the east end of Timmins, which includes the Porcupines also, had noticeably declined. These were historic mining communities. Why would they have declined so much? More than could be justified simply by the decline of the mining industry itself. Well, we wanted to look at that, but I didn't want it to be just another story of tragedy. I wanted to see, is there some part of this where we can take lessons forward for economic development? And it seemed to me that one of the key issues, and I've always been interested in the conditions of municipalities, communities, community economic development, democracy at the local level. could we look at something in particular, the forced amalgamation that created the first city of Timmins in 1973? There'd been a town and some surrounding small mining communities as well, and they were forcibly amalgamated into what was then the largest in its geography municipality in Canada. Now, it was part of a wave of amalgamations that occurred in Ontario at the time. And there was another wave later in the 90s. Both of these waves affected Sudbury, but I was going to, and also Thunder Bay and some other communities in Northern Ontario, but I wanted to look particularly at this one of Timmins. And it also involved, for example, ignoring of Indigenous land rights. These massive amalgamations just sort of trumped on Indigenous territories as well. So there are, the national question in particular is very important. It's also related to the issue of Francophone communities, because some of the communities in these forced amalgamations were in majority Francophone. In particular in the case of Sudbury, where the amalgamations have basically led to increased assimilation and pressure on Francophone community autonomy. So there's a lot of issues wrapped up in this. And you know, in general, the stories, one is growing centralization within these communities, less democracy, more inequality, and outflow of populations. So, you know, we have to look at this and look at it carefully, and that's what the research is about. And recently, we had foundation support from the Bickle Foundation and the Schumacher Foundation, both of whom have ties to the Timmins areas. And this helped produce some initial work. We've done some major interviews, including with the former Premier of Ontario, William Davis. And we've also done a lot of meetings with communities. We have partnered with the Schumacher Arts, Culture, and Heritage Association. And the work is moving. It's not always easy, but it's moving. And now we have grants from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, Connection Grant, and there's matching funds from the Schumacher Foundation, fortunately. And we also have an Insight grant. And all of this, while we're trying to do some work and create attention and have student research assistance, has been threatened and maybe lost because of this foolish, irresponsible move towards the CCAA. That's just part of the destruction. I mean, the whole idea of Laurentian as an educational institution, where there are critical elements of social science, where there's culture through the humanities and the arts, is being wrecked. There's no public discussion of its impact. None of the present Board of Governors has stood up, and certainly not the President and Vice President and others, and said, what will be the impact of this on social science and science in the Northern Ontario region? The impact on Francophone communities, on Indigenous communities? They've not discussed it. They've not discussed what is the implication for culture? What is the implication for accessibility? What will it mean for the new generation of students and for Northern Ontario? It's as though we were anywhere, not in Northern Ontario, not in a hinterland colonial area with its own set of problems and its particular needs, especially democracy. And you know, it could have been in a neighborhood in Toronto or something. It's just not responsive to the region. And I think if there's any characteristic that I would say that is in common with a long trend, is that this process has a very colonial hinterland character that is anti-democratic. It's anti-North, it's anti-democratic, but it's almost against any subordinate group. And we can talk about in more detail how any subordinate or disadvantaged group is hurt by what has just happened.
Thank you for that. And you've actually covered a lot of the questions I was going to be asking. But I'd like you to maybe reflect a little bit more on exactly, because your research is very much around the lack of democratic and community input into these major decisions that are going on in Northern Ontario. Could you talk a little bit more about how your research is actually very, very significant to what's going on today in Northern Ontario with Laurentian University in particular?
Well, let me approach this by saying that, you know, about 2 to 3 years ago, I started to think about what was happening to Laurentian after years and years of being here and seeing the loss of positions. Our economics department, our faculty of arts, many programs have been declining. You know, what's going on? And you know, like I'm in economics, so I would think, what's the revenue that's happening? What's the costs, and where are these things going? So I wanted to focus particularly on enrollments. And I'm going to just say a few words about this research and the context and why it's particularly a Northern Ontario problem. I found out, for example, that enrollments for undergraduates, full-time undergraduates in Northern Ontario at our 5 universities. We have 5 universities in Northern Ontario. You know, we have Nipissing, Sudbury, Laurentian University, Algoma, Hearst, and Lakehead, okay? And all of them, if you put all of their student undergraduates enrollments, have been declining for almost a decade. Mm-hmm. It's not new. But nobody's been talking about it in any very clear way as they compete with each other, trying to get others' enrollments or set up campuses in Southern Ontario to cover up what's happening here, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Laurentian itself has been declining probably for full-time undergraduate enrollment since about 2015. Now, why is that? And they never ask the question, why? Well, they'll say demography. So I wanted to look at that. Well, the fact is that the enrollment has been probably, and you know, there's not sufficient data on some point, but it's been declining faster than the demography. And in particular, it's been declining faster for the Faculty of Arts, but not only arts. I deal with arts, I'm in arts, and I'm particularly concerned about culture, cultural issues and social science as a critical voice in what's happening here. But it, you know, it's affected math and physics and other areas as well. So there is a problem, but our university leadership is not talking about it and the particular questions of Northern Ontario. They're behaving as though the neoliberal model, which is competing universities funded primarily by tuition fees, is the way to go. They refuse to criticize this model. They might say, well, we need more money. We need a little bit more for this program or that program, and so on. But they don't talk about the model. I'll come back to that in a moment. So as the enrollments are declining, we find in Laurentian in particular that there's still this mentality that we just build these more buildings, we fund these things, and students will come and the programs will flourish, et cetera, et cetera. It's totally hubris, it's delusion. And that's where the failure of the leadership at Laurentian occurred. There was no realism about what was happening. There may have been other types of malfeasance as well, and there needs to be, you know, a public inquiry, and as I've said before, a forensic audit and so on. It's utter irresponsible. It's irresponsible to the profs, to the students, to the community, and frankly, to education across the country to allow this to happen. Now, there are 2 things that I would just sort of say about this as an aspect, and I don't want to avoid your larger questions, but what is this neoliberal policy model in the universities? It's important for us to not, you know, to be more specific so that part of my critique is clear. Right at the moment, we're fighting a battle to save the university. So I'm fully in favor of what LUFA, OCUFA, the CAU2 have been arguing there needs to be emergency funding. And we should never have gone through the CCAA process. If we had serious political representation in the federal government, it would have been shut down immediately. Okay, so I'm fully in favor of those things, but it cannot be dealt with as a reform, as a way of stabilizing universities without looking at the underlying problems. And in particular, I expect that as a result of this measure, there will be a decline in interest in Laurentian. There will be a fear that this university is a poor university and a risky place to go.
Of course.
Okay, and there could be further declines in enrollment. Well, what will that mean? That will mean that they'll be talking about cutting positions further. So it could lead to a downward spiral. We don't know. I'm sure they'll do many things to try and make things look better and to, you know, purify the history so it's all whitewashed and, you know, there's not proper examination of what was the cause, et cetera, et cetera. So this model that's underlying suggests that there's two problems. There's one, there's an internal problem in the management, so-called, of Laurentian. There's a malfeasance issue, but there's also a system issue. And the system is this. Since the 1960s in Ontario, the universities have been set up on one scholar has called it an entrepreneurial model, where they're individually competing like corporations. Now, when the economy was growing through the 60s and 70s, the early 70s, you know, everybody could get a expansion, you know, as the pie was growing and as the funding was provided. Governments at the time were more sympathetic to education. But in the late 70s, certain things happened. The federal government, for example, established program financing, which reduced the amount of money, that was the Liberal government, reduced the amount of money going to education and health. And health tended to be favored over education, which was not protected. And so there was a downward pressure on funding for higher education. At the same time, there was, you know, a population wanting to go to higher education. Tuition fees were somewhat lower and more accessible at the time relative to the living standards of families. But, you know, there was no way out that the government, then very corporate oriented, saw but raising tuition fees. And that was the beginning of the neoliberal model in education. Raise the tuition fees rather than redistribute in order to protect public education. And it started provincially under the Conservative government, but it also continued with the Liberals and even sadly with the NDP and continued to this day. Right now, tuition fees are the major source of funding. And we have gone through a process which I call privatization. And I think it is, because what it means is that previously publicly funded education is now on private shoulders, which is primarily the students, with a little bit, far less than is realized from corporations. Okay, so we have this process then of this corporate structure coupled with rising tuition fees in this competitive model. Now, people will say, well, the system can be competing and, you know, people will go to the universities where they choose and, you know, there'll be this relatively stable system and so on. And I say, no, that's not the way it works in capitalism. The way it works is that the larger institutions with deeper pockets because they have more endowments and long traditions of established scholarship and arts and other things, more enriching curriculum, will outcompete the weaker institutions, and particularly in regions where incomes are lower, such as Northern Ontario. And so naturally, over time, the playing field is not equal. And those universities in more vulnerable areas with less resources, with fewer resources, will actually lose out. And there will be a concentration into the bigger universities. And this is what we see. We see less growth and even decline in Northern Ontario, and a gap in the scale of the universities. So now, relative to the Ontario system, the 5 northern universities are relatively small, and they do not have the student base to justify the overlay of massive administration. And one of my students has actually done a study showing, using the Sunshine List data, showing that in fact the gap in salaries since the Sunshine List was created has increased between the senior administration and the faculty. And there's been more change also in employment, to having more higher paid jobs in administration rather in the front lines in the classroom and research. So this system, which is competing corporate universities based on tuition, has to change. And in my opinion, one of the short run changes could be to stabilize the enrollment in the north through balancing provincial planning of enrollments to balance some of the enrollments in the north. I've tried to show that about 400,000, there are 400,000 full-time undergraduates in the Ontario system, even 1%, that's 4,000 students. If they could be planned to be reallocated to the north, would help stabilize the northern universities, and they would not have to build as much in the south, and there'd be a better capacity utilization in the system in the north. I've also argued that there should be, reduced tuition fees as a minimum to the level of the provincial fees in Quebec, and then eventually I would hope to be zero. And through these means, I think it would lead to a reorientation of the universities. I would like to see also that the northern universities not be allowed to expand into southern Ontario. I think they have a responsibility to northern Ontario and to increase the participation rates in education. And we haven't yet talked a lot about need, but I want to say a word about that. Northern Ontario has tremendous needs, and it's not simply in income and employment, although that's primary, but it's really also in educational. We have educational needs that are major, that are not being fulfilled. For example, we have a much lower level of even achieving a BA, a simple BA. It's about 2/3 the level, or 1/3 less than the level of the average for Ontario. For senior stuff and for research, for masters and doctorates, it's under half. I mean, we need researchers in Northern Ontario. We need people who are capable of looking beyond mining and other activities that would traditionally here to new types of economic activity, to health, to better food supply systems, to the green economy, to a million different things. And then there's culture. As a result of these cuts to Laurentian, we have no theater program in English. We have no theater program in French. The Laurentian administration, while talking about the importance of bilingualism and the tricultural mandate, has whacked the Études Françaises, the French department. They have eliminated French stream in history and the research that all that's implied. We've had just an absolute hostile approach to the federated universities. And that includes the Indigenous faculty in the University of Sudbury. I mean, when we hear the Board of Governors silent and our top administration wringing their hands about, their concerns for the bicultural and trilingual mandate, it falls flat on my ears. I just don't believe it, and I don't think anyone in the public should believe it. And the only way to counteract that is for a more democratic approach to the education system. So a couple other things I advocate also for, saving the present system in Northern Ontario, what we have, as limited as it is that there needs to be demands that the federal government intervene majorly. And I'm talking about, for example, a full funding of Indigenous education, not this half measures, but full living up to the treaty obligations. And secondly, to defend minority language rights in the French programs. And I support 100% the desire of Francophone profs and the community in Sudbury to have their own autonomous university in Sudbury, however that will eventually fit within an Ontario system. A fourth thing I would also say is that there needs to be some form of more democratic participation in the running of Laurentian. Right now, I'll give you an example, just a very practical one for people who are listening, and I'm sorry if I'm talking on so much about this, but I've obviously been energized by this problem. I'm sorry, Monique.
We're doing a teaching.
Sorry.
We're doing a teaching. It's all good. It's all good.
When I started to do some research on enrollment, I can do it myself, but it would have helped if I had the involvement of a student assistant or research assistant. I was denied with the system of information called Tableau at the university. I was denied access even for a student who would work under my supervision to look at the data. Now, in my view, that's an example of how the university does not want people to know what's going on in the programs. I think it should be available to students so they know what's happening to enrollment in various programs, but also to the general public because it's a public university. The public should know what is the enrollment at Laurentian or Algoma or Nipissing or Hearst or Lakehead, and they should know how many professors there are and how many employees and how many administrators. These things should be known. This is not secret. If it's going to be a public university, it's their property, it's their voice in education. And so I advocate complete transparency about these things, inquiries where they're necessary, etc. But also we have to think maybe more about the election of people to boards of governors, whether it's of an individual university or what I hope in the future will be a Northern Ontario university system, and with far different priorities than the current system at Laurentian. So those are some of the things that have motivated me, in particular around the educational part. Now I can go into more detail about some of the other parts of the research, but I think I better let you guys in because I'm talking too much.
It's all good stuff, David. Okay, well, you have actually covered a lot of what we wanted to talk about. But before we go back to your personal experience here in Sudbury and as a professor, is there anything at this point that if you had a chance to speak to either Ross Romano or Doug Ford or Robert Haché, what are the messages that you would want to give them at this point right now? What is the important thing that they should be hearing right now?
Well, I have called publicly for Mr. Romano's resignation. I think that he's lost credibility, and it would be hard for him to change gears. So there needs to be somebody to replace him. But if I had had a chance to talk with him before, which would be, I think, more democratic, if he could have, for example, talked to the professors or talked to people who had done some research about the conditions, or even, believe it or not, talked to the community. If he had actually deigned to do that, I think what would have happened would be a series of alternatives. Okay, now history will show what, through I hope the records and the correspondence, what was exactly the strategy. A lot of that's speculative right now, but my view is that there's an anti-labor animus. Like part of this is an anti-working class, anti-union thing, and so they don't want to talk to the workers, to employees, to ordinary people about the consequences. This is a class attitude, and I would say everybody in the North will benefit by a different approach. And Mr. Romano, you're from the Sioux. This community is not in great shape, and it will not be helped by the kind of attitude you're taking to Sudbury and Laurentian University. And I would say, I hope like hell that it's not because you see a competitive advantage for the Sioux by beating down on Sudbury. Now, some people think that maybe there's an anti-French thing going on, you know, relative to Sudbury. I might even say something about that. I would say something to him about, what is the advantage to try and whack Indigenous programs, Mr. Romano? Tell me, what is the advantage? What do you gain as a Northerner when you know that Indigenous people play such an important role in Northern Ontario? Why do you want to whack their opportunities like that? And they'll pussyfoot and dance around the issue and not really address it directly, but we'll say something like, well, it's their own fault, it's the system, da 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 da, there's no alternative, classic kind of thing going back to Margaret Thatcher or whatever. But there are many alternatives. There were alternatives long before, but they won't happen unless there's a more active political opposition to what's going on, and it needs to be across the North. We Northerners need to understand that this is a structural issue, and you know, the Ross Romanos will come and go, and they'll do their bit, and we'll suffer, and things will not change for the better. They just won't under the present system. You know, there'll be a few crumbs here and a few crumbs there, but the general trend will be for population to leave, and some of our children will leave, and the next generation children will leave, and the research will decline, and you'll lose a music program there, and a drama and a theater program here, and well, we've never had a dance program to speak of, but you know, and we'll lose some progressive economics or sociology or whatever in some other place, and gradually there will be a disintegration, and more students will say, well, if they want a serious education, where do they go? Southern Ontario, Quebec, BC, you know, Halifax, you know, some other place. So I would tell him that, and I would hope, just on our basis of our common humanity, he would understand that Northern Ontario does not benefit, and you know, I would say the educational system as a whole does not benefit from this approach.
Thank you.
Well, coming from Sault Ste. Marie, I can tell you that Ross Romano doesn't even listen to his own constituents, never mind listening to constituents outside of his electoral district. So a lot of frustration with Ross Romano, I think, generalized. If we can shift gears a little bit and just talk about how all this is affecting you and your coworkers that were the victims of those barbaric cuts that happened on April 12th. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I was there in these group executions, and I'd like to just sort of give my perspective on what went down that day. First of all, we were waiting, and it was a tremendous tension, and I could feel it physically, as did other members of faculty, wondering what was going to happen. When was the hammer coming down? And there are many problems that will have to be discussed in, you know, retrospect, like how could union people have, you know, acted differently to pry loose more information and all sorts of other issues. Those are issues for the future. But I think that there was an atmosphere of generalized tension and despair and lack of power. That's part of the process to disempower, you know, the people who are affected. But then we received this email. It's called Invitation Mandatory. Now that itself is worth a skit, but we met. I was in the 930 group, and there were about 20, and it was addressed by Dr. Berger, for about a few minutes. I intervened and asked a question, but it was poo-pooed and sent off, and basically it was turned over to somebody from human resources. And I have to say that they did not speak well in French, and most of the members there were in French, and I could just feel the emotions. You know, this is the final insult of Laurentian, where you can't even fire people in their own language. I mean, just think about the reverberations of that through history and the treatment of the Franco-Ontarians and all the, you know, the national minority, the French-Canadian national minority anywhere in the country. Just think about the reverberations of that experience. And then it was passed to a corporate trend, you know, a corporate firm that consults in layoffs and this kind of transitions, you know, and the literature they sent were things like, you know, for your new exciting second career, you know, how to develop your, you know, your CV, how to write your resume kind of thing. I mean, I don't want to go to it too much. It's almost painful to think about how little they considered the sentiments and the history of the people present. So that's why when I hear the executives, and they're in the full sense of executive, of the Laurentian or the university system, that I know from personal experience that their understanding of where the faculty and the cultural and national issues are at is absolutely absent, okay? They are operating at a different level. I would say a class level, but also even in terms of the national question, they haven't got it. They just haven't got it. And for that reason alone, I don't want them to stay. I don't think they could pull it together even if they had an honest desire to. They just do not have the chops, okay? They just do not have the human capacity for that kind of thing. That's not their world. They don't have the experience here. They come from away and they haven't brought themselves into contact with the real issues of Northern Ontario and the community. So my feeling was aggravated by that. It was quite depressing. You know, I know that there were 5 others similar, and as a whole, 84 people were fired. And some of us, me, for example, was the last day is Friday, the 30th. So many more others were for May 15th. One of the members was pregnant and was asking about, you know, how this would affect her maternity leave. And they couldn't give a proper answer. You think about that. Like, just think about what that means for that, you know, child to be, and for the mother. Outrageous. Like, it was outrageous, but I would say I could see it in the faces. I felt it myself, and it was repeated and repeated and repeated. I think that and many of the other comments that occurred in the following days, the hypocrisy of it all, set in motion as a process of social distancing and dissolution. And it was, you know, it was one of the things I think that motivated the Francophone professors in particular to unify, to leave Laurentian. The abject incompetence and insensitivity of the university leadership. And it has to be said, the Board of Governors. Not one of the Board of Governors to this point has resigned, and they should have. Any integrity about Northern Ontario and about the treatment of the people who loyally worked for them for many years should have led them to resign. Other things happened in my emotional, I'm describing more of a subjective thing, but I'm trying to give you my feelings about some of the things. I think the union suffered through it all as well, because they were either of choice or more likely a combination of that, and also the pressures of the CCAA, unable really to engage with the membership. I think the gap emerged there as well. But the biggest gap was with the university administration and board of governors. And I don't think it will be easily repaired. Now, those of us who others I've talked to, you know, we're very busy trying to sort of, in my case, for example, and several others, trying to save our research. And I'll say something separately about the details of that if you're interested. Some are concerned about students who they currently are teaching. I'm on sabbatical leave and I don't have immediate students with me, although there are some who are research assistants who, you know, I want to make sure, you know, are able to finish off and get credit for their work and pay when they need it and so on. But some students, for example, those who are teaching graduate students, may want to contact the professor. And the university has threatened, for example, to eliminate our email and telephones. Why would they not think about that for a university that's so interested in the students? I mean, I don't know. I have an idea. I could speculate what their attitude, and it's learned from corporate layoffs, that you want to really clean out any possible dissent and connection and sanitize the history, right?
In Spanish, it's called tabula rasa.
C'est ça. And I've also seen health issues. I think, I don't have data, but I think it should be something that people look at one day, about, you know, the health impacts and what it's meant, particularly the social psychological ones, in the midst of a pandemic.
Yeah.
And I want to emphasize that this occurred where the power imbalance was even more against unions and working people in the midst of a pandemic. So this is not just the CCA, but the CCA in the midst of a pandemic. Now, there's another group of employees that have been, I think, unfairly ignored in this process. So besides those of us who were fired, or as the administration word is, impacted, were a number between 25 and 30 who were pressured into early retirement. So we're in the range of about 120 there. But then there's the people, our colleagues and allies in the federated universities, you know, 20 to 25 perhaps full time. And then there's many part-timers, many. And Laurie, you might want to say something about that too. And then there are staff. Like I just, you know, there's a technician, for example, in psychology who I've known for a long time, and others who I've heard have been terminated, and it's just wrong. It's just wrong the way we have been treated, and a lot of talent, which is the word that is used by the university often, commitment, skills have been thrown away. And I would say, you know, even some of the administrators themselves, they don't honor their own people even. Some were encouraged to come into administration, fired, and then denied return to the ranks as professors in departments that were not closed. So, I mean, it's like the war of all against all.
Yeah, we don't have exact numbers either, do we?
No.
Of how many people have actually lost their jobs. We don't know.
Yeah, so this is like, I mean, we can have a separate discussion on the inadequacy of the media, but for example, there's been no serious what they used to call investigative journalism into the history of the, of what has happened, digging out numbers and other things, either in the provincial government. One hopes that somebody in the Ministry of Colleges and Universities will one day leak some of this stuff, or even within the administration of Laurentian, so the public will know something about how their universities are being, and colleges system is being organized. And they call it restructured, but I would call it destructured. I think it's becoming less and less structured in the interests of the population. My general position would be that, like right now, people are fighting for, myself included, to just sort of deal with the day-to-day insults and necessities. For example, we don't even know if I'll have access to emails on Friday or Saturday, if I'll lose all my research funds, which amount to nearly 150,000 in old money and new money. And, so much of that is, well, I feel badly, not only for myself, but I really feel badly for the students who, I've drawn into the research, and for the communities that I've partnered with, my, colleague filmmaker, the people who are expecting something to happen with the work, my obligations, for example, to the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council or the Schumacher Foundation and so on. This is like, none of this was considered. I'm sorry for going on, but and in a better situation, I might be more structured and to the point.
No. I think this is really, really important. And we certainly all watched with horror that day as all of you were getting fired. We were on social media and messages were creeping up on Facebook, 20 more fired, 20 more fired. It was just horrendous. It felt like we were witnessing, well, Laurie, you called it a bloodbath.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to have to wrap up, David, but as you know, Save Our Sudbury, Sauvons Sudbury, of which you are a member too, is determined to keep up this fight. We won't stop, and we will get through to this government somehow. They will never be allowed to get away with this. So to everyone listening, make sure that you write letters, call your elected representatives at the municipality, at the province, with the feds, tell them to stop the CCAA, to force the Board of Governors to resign, as well as President Robert Haché, provide emergency funding for Laurentian University, put a moratorium on these stupid actions that they're taking, and support the right of Indigenous people and Francophones to determine their own educational future. You still have time to write letters. There's lots of information circulating on Save Our Sudbury, Sauvons Sudbury. So get to it, write those letters. It's really not that hard. There's lots of examples out there. Alors, de la part de Sauvons Sudbury, Laurie, did you want to say anything else?
No, I just want to thank David for sharing at a very emotional time and a very hard time, for sharing some really important information. And yeah, thank you for that.
You're very welcome.
De la part de Sauvons Sudbury, merci beaucoup, David. Merci beaucoup de ton engagement envers la région du Nord, de ton engagement envers la communauté universitaire de la Laurentienne et envers les étudiants aussi. Et on se revoit au mois de septembre prochain.
Oui, à la prochaine.
À la prochaine.
Merci.
Bye. Stop recording now.
Ali?
Yeah, I'll stop the recording.